So I'm back again in the studio today and I'm finishing off some original tracks, some remixes, ready to go to record labels. And that of course means doing some mastering. Now I realised I haven't really talked about this on my channel before, and I've touched on it in Sonic Academy tutorials, but I've never actually shown you how I do my mastering. Now I'm going to say up front that every single track that I do, before it goes to a record label, it goes off to a proper mastering engineer. I love getting that second pair of ears so I know that it's perfect before it goes on sale. But when I finish a track, I want to be able to play it in my sets. I want to be able to get some feedback on it and see if I need to tweak it at all, which of course then I need to do my own mastering on. So I've got my own kind of quick and dirty way of mastering, which is what I'm going to touch on today. I'm going to show you two methods, one using the standard Ableton plugins and one using some plugins that I use all the time. So we're going to jump into that right now.
Let's get it. Let's get it, baby.
Okay, so let's talk about mastering. And just like music production, everybody's got their own way of doing it. Their own methods, their own preferred plugins to get the most out of their tracks. Now, mastering is one of those skills you're not going to learn overnight. It requires years worth of practice of analysing tracks, knowing when to use certain tools, knowing when something's going wrong and how to fix it. It requires a lot of work and a lot of experience. Now, that's not to say that you can't do your own master. I don't want to put you off this. The way I see it, there's two circumstances where you need a master. The first is you've just finished a track and you want to be able to play it out in your DJ set. And the second is when you finish a track and you want to send it to a record label or to another DJ. Now, in the second circumstance, I would send it to a mastering engineer. The main reason for that is I want a fresh pair of ears on that track. I want somebody who hasn't heard that track before, who's impartial about it, to make the most out of it. I want it sounding as good as humanly possible before it goes out to the big wide world. Now, when I finish the track and I just want to play it out in my own sets, I don't necessarily want to send it to an engineer each time, because I might rework that track or tweak that track several different times before it finally goes to a record label. And I don't want to send it to a mastering engineer every time I do that. So this is when I do my own mastering, and this is what I call quick and dirty mastering. Now in this video I'm going to go over two methods for that. The first is using Ableton plugins, the standard Ableton plugins, to get a decent enough master to be able to play in your own sets. The second one is using my favourite plugins for doing that kind of stuff. These are third-party plugins that I use all the time to do my own masters. Now these masters are by no means great. They're not the best masters. They are good enough to play out. I will hold my hand up and say I am not an expert at mastering. I do enough to be able to play my tracks out. That does the job for me. But when the track's ready and it's good to go to record labels, that's when I get a mastering engineer involved, because then it's ready. For me, though, this quick and dirty method is good enough to play out, and that's what we're going to concentrate on today. Okay, so jumping into Ableton, and this is a brand new track of mine that I've just finished, and it's time to master it. Now, looking at the master channel, you can see there's nothing on there at the moment, so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to get into mastering it. Now, I will say that this track is fully mixed and ready to master. So by that, I mean that all the volume levels are right, all the EQ is done, everything is kind of fixed as I need it to be, it's sounding good, it's just time for mastering. Now I mix as I go, so it makes it a lot easier at this mastering stage. If you're doing a lot of tweaks to the EQ on the master channel, then your mix probably isn't right. So you probably best go back and fix that first before you start mastering. It will make your job so much easier. And mixing as you go, again, it's one of those things that just makes your life a whole lot easier when you come to the end of the project. You're not doing a whole load of tweaks on it. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure we have plenty of headroom on the track. Now, if you've heard the term headroom before, but you're not sure what it means, basically you need to take down all the volume levels of all the tracks so that we've got enough room to play with. So when we add mastering, we're adding loudness as well. And if we're adding loudness to an already loud signal, then we could get distortion from that, and that won't sound good. So we need to make sure that all the levels are brought down quite a bit. Now, in my usually I'll bring them down by about 4 dB, maybe 6 dB. Nothing too much, but enough to give you enough space. And that's what we're going to do here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we're playing back the loudest part of our track. Now for me, that's usually just after the main breakdown. I usually create a loop on here, and then we can listen back to this loudest part. Now this is fairly easy to do from the arrange view, but it's actually easier to do from the session view within Ableton. You can see on here we have the meters on the right hand side here, but we've got no indication of what the loudness is. If we switch over to the session view and we have a look at the master channel, we can actually have a look at what the levels are peaking at. So if I play this back, so we can see it's actually peaking at minus 0.7 dB on here, which is quite loud at the moment. It's not getting into the red too much, but it is a bit too loud at the moment. Now we need to take down the volume levels of everything within here, and obviously we could do that one by one, but that's just going to take so much time. So what I tend to do is I tend to click on one track within here, so one main track within here, and then select them all. So on a Mac keyboard, Apple and A, or on a Windows machine, it will probably be Control and A, and that selects all of your tracks for you. So you can see all the tracks that have been selected in here. And what I can do now is I can just take down the volume levels of one of these tracks and it will take them all down in one go. So it makes it a lot easier to mix with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these down until we get good, like maybe minus 4 dB on here. There we go, we're going about minus 6 dB there, which I think is actually going to be good enough to work with. We can always up the volume later, but you can't decrease it without getting, and get rid of the distortion. You'll still get distortion in there. So minus 6 dB, that's probably going to be good enough to work with. So yeah, so we've got that in there. Now we can start putting our mastering plugins on the master channel. So the first thing I like to do is I like to put some saturation in the mix. Now the first thing most people will do is put an EQ in there to make sure anything's been fixed. But I tend to like putting the saturation in there first because I like saturating the whole signal. So everything that's coming in and then probably putting the EQ after that. The saturation will probably affect your EQ anyway. It adds extra frequencies and you might find you need to tweak some things after that. But I put a gentle amount of saturation in there just to give it a bit more drive, just to give it something. For me, with my kind of more dirty house kind of sound, I like that saturation in there. Again, it's totally up to your own preference on that one. So I'm going to drop some saturation in here with the default saturator plugin within Ableton. Just going to drag and drop that on the master channel, and I'm not going to concentrate too much on most of the different parameters on here. We're going to keep it on fully wet on here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase the drive a little bit, just to kind of give us some crunch in there. Not too much that it becomes distorted, but just so it gives it some character. So I've added about 4 dB worth of drive in there. It's not distorting it at the moment, it's just kind of giving it a bit more grit. I've also turned the soft clip on there, just in case anything clips, but I don't think it will do. You'll also notice that our volume levels have jumped straight up on the master channel again, so we need to take them down again. Now I don't need to take down the volume levels of all the different channels again, because the saturator plugin here has an output volume level. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set this at -4, so we're almost kind of cancelling out the drive that we just put in there. So I'm putting about 4 dB worth of drive, and then I'm taking it down in output by 4 dB. So we should be about the same type of level, but we've got that saturated signal in there now. So we've got, it's the same kind of volume levels, but I think with the saturator, for me, when you're adding a bit more drive, it just sounds a bit bigger for me, and for my kind of sound, it kind of works. So that's how I use the saturator. A good thing for this is to just test out saturator by turning it on and off and seeing what it does. So I've put that saturator in there now, and that kind of just, it adds a bit more grip, it adds a bit more drive. It just has that something that I use for my sound. I actually use the saturator on quite a few different channels as well, quite often on my drums. So yeah, that saturator is in there on the master channel, just a very subtle amount, just to kind of, it almost kind of pushes it all together. Now, talking of pushing it all together, I also put the glue compressor on there. That's one of my favorite things. I've been using the glue compressor for many, many years. And I just dropped that on the master channel. And again, this is probably something that I'm actually going to use on the default settings. It's only doing a very subtle amount of gluing to the track. Just makes it all glued together, makes it sound as one. So when I put the glue compressor on here, I'm looking for very small amounts of movement from the needle that's on the compressor. That's all I'm doing, just a very subtle amount of compression on here. So as you can see, the glue compressor there is just slightly moving. The little needle's just slightly moving. It's just a little bit of compression and it's kind of gluing everything together. You could spend a bit more time kind of working with it if you wanted to, but for me, the standard settings just kind of work good for me. They just kind of glue everything together. The glue compressor was one of my favorite ever external plugins before Ableton bought it out, and I'm so glad they built it in because it's such an amazing plugin. But yeah, straight off the bat, straight with the default preset, it works pretty well. I've adjusted the threshold a little bit just to get a little bit more movement on that needle. But yeah, that's kind of working what I need it to be anyway. So, okay, so next I'm going to put an EQ8 on the master channel. Now, as I say, I mix as I go along, so there's not really the need to kind of fix the EQ on my master channel so much. Everything should be sitting quite nicely, no problem frequencies, they should all be fixed by now. So I don't really need to do that on the master channel. The reason I'm putting the EQ8 in is so that I can get a bit more out of that master mix, maybe get the mix a little bit louder. Now, the reason I put this in there is because generally in the lower kind of frequencies, you have these kind of bass frequencies that take up a lot of room, but you don't necessarily hear. Now, if you're EQing them out on the channels, that's good practice, that's what should be done. However, you might have some plugins after that, or some things that kind of appear in the mix, or something you've missed out on, or even something that's introduced with the saturation or the glue compressor that kind of changes those bottom frequencies, that maybe adds something in there or affects them in some way. That's why I cut a bit more out of that bottom frequency at this stage. So I'm going to roll a little bit off of the bottom end. I'm not going to do too extreme, maybe between 30 and 40 hertz, just to kind of give me a bit more room in that mix. So I've taken that down to about 36 hertz, which I think works quite well for this track. Depending on the key of your track and the weight of the drums, the kick drum for example, you're going to cut it at a load of different levels. I find between 30 and 40 kind of works quite well, but even depending on the key of the track, then I might want to cut it less or cut it more. If it's in a lower key, for example, then the bass notes are going to be lower, and therefore I won't be able to cut it as high as I would normally. So you have to kind of make those adjustments as you go along. But for this track, 36 hertz kind of works. Now, I would also maybe tweak the top end as well, because when you've been in the studio for a while, your ears kind of get used to that kind of high-end kind of sound, and you keep boosting it and boosting it and boosting it. So you end up with a track which has got lots of highs, and when you come to listen to it a day later or a week later, you kind of hear those highs are just too extreme. So you maybe want to take a shelf on the top here and just kind of take those high end off a little bit. I'll have a listen to it back and see if I need to do that. Actually, no, it looks like, I think at some stage in my last mix, when I last hit this track, I probably took those highs down quite a bit. So I actually boosted them a little bit with a little bit of a shelf on there, just to give it a little bit of air, something in there. Again, it's just a really subtle change. I'm not doing anything too massive on here. Also, if you get to this stage and you feel like something's not working in the mix, then just kind of abort the mastering process, go back to the mix, get it fixed, and then do the mastering process again, because you don't want to be jumping between the mixing and the mastering. It just becomes a nightmare. It becomes harder to get that master mix right. And so the final thing we're going to put on our master channel is the limiter. And this is what's going to bring it up to club standards. This is going to be what makes it loud. Now, we can be as extreme with this as we want to be, but I prefer being a bit more subtle, and that seems to work quite well. So the limiter is actually set up really well by default. The ceiling is set to 0.3 dB, and that actually works really well. We're not going to change that. The release is set to auto, again, works really well. I'm going to change the look ahead to 6 milliseconds, just something I usually do, and that works for me. And then we're going to adjust the gain until we start seeing something happen on the meter here. Now, when something happens on the meter, that means the limiter is really starting to work. It's starting to squish it. Now, if you want it more extreme, then you'll see a whole load of stuff going on within that meter. I like to do it more subtly, so you should only see a few little kind of maybe hints of something happening within there. That basically means it's being squashed. Now, if you squash it too much, yes, it will sound really loud, but you're losing all those kind of dynamics. You're not going to hear all that nice kind of subtlety of the track. Depending on your style of music, that might be fine by you. I like to do it a little bit more subtly, so I'm just going to increase that gain just subtly, in subtle amounts, very easily, and we'll just see how it goes. So let's play back the loudest part of the track again, and we're just going to increase the gain. So there you go, you can see that I've boosted it by about 5 dB, and it's given us that weight back, it's given us that volume. You can see the meter there is doing some work, so we can see the limiter that's kicking in, but it's not squashing it too much that we're losing all of our dynamics. And that's generally kind of all that I do on the mastering channel, to kind of master a track using Ableton stock plugins. Now, one thing we can do is we can actually group all of these plugins together. So we select them all, right click, and then group them. And that will create a little mastering group for us that we could then use in the future if we wanted to, and drop it onto another channel. But one of the great things this does, it allows us to kind of turn it all on and all off, so you can hear what it sounds like before and after. So you can definitely hear the difference between that being on and off. Of course, we took all the volume levels down, so it will be quieter with it off. But you can also hear the sound from the saturator, that kind of grittier signal. The glue compressor of it, pushing it all together and make it sound sweet. Then we've got the EQ, which is surgically taking some of that bottom end out, giving us more opportunity to get more volume out of it. And then the limiter on the end to boost it all back up again. And that's kind of a basic mastering channel with Ableton stock plugins. That's something I would use if I wasn't using external plugins. And it works really nicely for just creating that master that you might want to just play out tonight. Rather than sending it off to a mastering engineer, you can actually play your track out tonight with just some simple mastering techniques. And it's good enough to kind of play up against any other track in your set. So that's how I'd master my mix using stock Ableton plugins. It's something I've done in the past, and it's something I've done in tutorials that I've done for Sonic Academy. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you now how I do it with third-party plugins. There's some third-party plugins that I love using, that I use all the time for my mastering mixes. And it wouldn't be right for me to just show you the stock ones and I'm not using them at the moment. I'm going to show you exactly what I use now, because that's exactly what I use. I wanted to show you the stock ones because those are the free options. You've already got Ableton, you've already got access to those tools. These are the third-party ones that I use that I find really good, and that's why I use them. So we're going to jump into this again, and I've cleared out the master channel, and I'm going to start adding some of the ones that I've got within here. So the first thing I drop on my master channel usually is an external audio effect, and this basically routes out through my sound card to the Elektron Analog Heat. Now the analog heat is an external saturation unit. Basically what it does is it takes the signal, runs it through analog circuitry and gives you that lovely saturation that you get from analog gear. It's got several different settings for the different types of distortion and grunge and saturation. I use it to a very subtle amount, but it works really nicely on my mix, and that's generally why I use it. It's not one of those things that are necessary. That's why I showed you the saturation unit within Ableton. That works very, very well. But there's something about external analog kit and hardware kit that works really nicely. And I found it adds that nice bit of warmth, that bit of noise, and it makes it sound quite raw, and it really fits with my sound. So that's why I use the analog heat, and I can't recommend it highly enough. So that's the first thing I use in my chain. So the next thing I do in this master chain is I put some compression on it. And again, I use the Glue compressor. Now the Glue compressor I have been using for years, and actually as a plugin before it got bought by Ableton, it was by a company called Cytomic. Now this is the original Glue compressor. I love the interface. I think it's fantastic. And just out of habit, I tend to use this version rather than the inbuilt one in Ableton. I couldn't tell you if there's any difference between the two. There might be. I haven't actually listened to the two in comparison, but I really like the original version. I kind of use that a lot. And in fact, I use one of the presets within here. There's mastering presets within here, one called the Glue and the Glue 2. These work kind of really well. The transparent final master preset works pretty well as well. But I use the Glue. That's generally the one that I use the most on this. So I'm going to put that on there. And that's generally how I start my chain off. So if we listen back to this, actually I'll disable the heat and I'll disable the Glue for now. We can hear how it changes it. So you can kind of hear the analog heat there. It's kind of taking some of that digitalness out of the track. It's kind of not necessarily dulling it down, but it kind of, I know, it kind of molds it into more of an analog-y kind of sound. So you're not got that kind of roar of the digital in there. It kind of, yeah, smooths it out almost. That's the best as I can describe it. And for me, who works mostly in the box, the actual analog heat is one of the only things that I use external usually, certainly for processing anyway. So for me, it kind of takes that digital signal, which just sounds too clean, and kind of adds that warmth to it. So that's why I love using that. Then the Glue compressor, as I say, it just, I don't know what it does. I really can't work it out. It's one of those things that is just like black magic. I'm not quite sure, but the Glue compressor just works beautifully. I very rarely have to tweak it. It just kind of adds that extra bit, and it's one of those plugins. When I first found it and I first started using it, I was like, yes, that changes the game. That just worked for me. So the Glue compressor is one of those things that I use all the time. So the final thing in my master channel is a tool that I use all the time. It's something that really, really divides producers. Some love it, some hate it. Mastering engineers, some look down on it, some of them use it. It's one of those things that I use all the time. I find it absolutely essential. It's Izotope Ozone 8. Now, I've been using Ozone for years. I've had the last 2-3 versions, but Ozone 8 is just an amazing bit of software. It's become so sophisticated with 7 different versions behind it. It's learned a lot of tricks. It knows how to do so much stuff. It's got an EQ in there, compressors in there, maximizers or limiters. It's got so much stuff wrapped up in there, but the most amazing feature is this thing called the Master Assistant. This basically helps you master your track, and believe me, I use it all the time because it is a fantastic starting point. It will not replicate a mastering engineer. A mastering engineer will almost always do a better version than Ozone will. But if you're doing your own masters, if you need something quick, then it is a fantastic way of getting that loudness, about getting that sound, getting that club ready sound out of your track. So let's have a look at the Master Assistant, because that's pretty much where I start from here. You can use a whole load of different presets within Ozone to match up to your genre if you want to kind of create a master that fits that. But to be honest, the Master Assistant really works well because it listens to your track and makes suggestions. So when we jump into the Master Assistant, there's 3 different modes. We've got streaming, CD, and reference. Streaming is if you want it to match it to something that's like, that's going to go out to Spotify, Apple Music, SoundCloud. CD is when you want it to be mastered for a club. You've got 3 different intensities here, low, medium, and high. And then finally we got reference, which is actually my favorite mode. So basically you can take any track in your collection, use it as a reference, and what Ozone will do is it will try and match it for loudness, EQ, and things like that. It won't make it sound exactly the same, but it will apply similar techniques to get it up to that same kind of standard. Again, it won't work every time, but it actually works really well in some circumstances. So let's give it a go. So the first thing we need to do is jump into the reference part, add a reference. And generally I've got a folder full of reference tracks that I use. So these are tracks that I really love. I've played them in my sets. They go down well. They sound musically, sonically quite good. So they're kind of ones that I kind of really match my ear to. So let's pick one from here. For example, Flash Mob. We've got this Flash Mob track here. If I double click on this, it will now load it in and it will analyze it for all the different aspects of it. So its loudness, its EQ and things like that. And then you can see here that we've got the whole track within here. Now what I can do is I can play certain bits of this back. Now first of all, we're actually going to hear our original track. But what I can do is I can switch over to the reference track. So we've got 2 different tracks there. We can actually listen to the reference. So we could make our own tweaks ourselves if we want to. We could match them both up by listening A and B. But the Master Assistant does all of that for you and it's amazing to use. So I hit the Master Assistant button, then go to reference. You'll see that that track that I've already loaded in there is in there. So I've got the reference track within there. Now I just need to click next, play the track, and it will start matching it. There you go, you can see that it's done all of this work for us. It's actually set up an EQ, it's put some EQ curves in there, so it's kind of looked at the track and seen when where we're kind of lacking. So in my track I'm lacking a bit of bass, for example. The reference track that I gave it was a lot more bassy, so it's given a bit more bass in the bottom end. It's scooping out a bit more in the middle, so we're getting rid of some of the mids, and then it's boosting the high, giving a little bit of air. It's done all this by analysing both tracks. It's amazing. We've then got some dynamic EQ, which is actually, dynamic EQ is actually put in there to kind of compensate for some of the maximizer or the limiter, what that's been doing. It's just black magic. I don't know how it does it all. And then we've got the maximizer within here, which is kind of just, as I say, it's the limiter, it's what makes it loud, and it's just doing those subtle maximize. It just subtly limits the track, brings it up in volume, and it does all those kind of stuff. So yeah, this Master Assistant works so well. Depending on which reference track you pick, you might want to pick 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4. See which one comes out with the best master. You know, for this track, I might pick 2 or 3 and see which master comes out better, sounding better. So yeah, that's kind of how I do it. So the Master Assistant is a really good starting point. And from here, you can then tweak it. Say, for example, with this Master Assistant, sometimes it goes overboard on the maximizer, on the limiter. So sometimes I back it off a little bit. So in this case, I actually thought it could do with a bit more. So what I've done is I've taken down the threshold a bit, so it's pumping a little bit more. You can see the reaction that's happening. You can see the gain reduction happening in there. So I've just given it a little bit more limiting. Make it a little bit louder, just to give it a bit more, a bit more presence, a bit more volume. So yeah, you can kind of tweak it as you go along. So that master assistant is really just a starting point, and you can then tweak it on from there. But it really saves you so much time trying to work this kind of stuff out. And especially if you just need to do a very quick master. If you spend all day making a track, you've got an hour before you have to leave to go out and, you know, play your set. You want to be able to do that master really quickly, and this is a great tool for doing that. I don't usually recommend kind of one-stop shops for doing things, because you're never quite sure what's going on under the surface. You kind of want to do it yourself. You want to understand exactly what's going on. But Ozone does it so well. It's actually a really amazing tool to have in your arsenal just in case you need it. So that's how I master my tracks. It's a quick and dirty way to do it, but it works. As I say, when I come to send my tracks out to record labels, other DJs, I will get them professionally mastered. But when you've just finished a track and you want to play it out that night, these techniques really work well. I wanted to show you both the Ableton stock way of doing it, so you can use the free plugins that you've already got, and also the actual plugins that I use, the third-party plugins that I use. So there's no mystery here, you can see exactly how I master my tracks. So yeah, as I say, it's a quick and dirty way of doing it, but it works. I hope you enjoyed this video. I love sharing my tips and tricks with you guys. I've learned music production through the years just through playing around. So if any of my knowledge helps any of you, then I'll be extremely happy. If you did enjoy this video, give the video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification icon so you're notified whenever I upload a brand new video. I've got a whole load more content like this on my channel, so definitely be sure to check that out, and I'll see you again in the next video.
Let's get it, baby. Let's get it. Let's get it, baby. Yeah. So pretty, baby.